Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Small Axe Radical Short Film Awards podcast. Today I have with me Alex Johnston, whose film Dark Cell Harlem Farm will be screening at our festival. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.
Wonderful. It's good to have you here. Alex is an award-winning documentarian, media maker, and scholar based in Seattle, Washington. His work is screened at a wide range of venues, including the Berlinale, AFI, Sheffield Doc Fest, Indie Lisboa, London Short Film Festival, Camden International Film Festival, and the Miners Colfax Medical Center, a convalescent home for hard rock and coal miners in rural New Mexico. He is also an editor of the radical online media journal Now, a journal of urgent praxis, and is an assistant professor of film at Seattle University. So Alex, I was hoping we'd start the interview by just going through how Dark Cell Harlem Farm came to be made.
Yeah, of course. It has this film has sort of a tortuous and probably torturous production history a little bit, in that I actually the material that's shot, as I say in the title at the beginning, was actually shot way back in 2015. As we'll get into the topic of the film shortly, it was a sort of event that I had some interest in. I actually made a previous film about this incident. That was a sort of dry run. I made it sort of between, a research trip and then a production trip. But I brought a person who shoots most of my films, DP, who's brilliant filmmaker in her own right, and she shot with me. But we had some issues with production down there in terms of rain, storms, weather, some weather issues, some stuff, and she had some issues with her equipment, and so the shoot was sort of snake bit, and so I had tried to kind of cut it together back in 2016 or so, and it wasn't cutting together very well, and so I just put it down, and I, maybe in some distant future I'd go back to it, and then COVID hit. But as importantly as COVID hitting and needing projects that were already, shot, because we couldn't do new production. I also, this was in America, the killing of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, and the sudden rise in mainstream public discourse in America around just the term abolition, the idea of abolition, which prior to that had been, was very much a sort of marginalized, way of thinking about the world and about the criminal justice system. And so those two things, the circumstance of COVID locking down, but then also the emergence of this made me want to sort of pick this film back up and to go from something that was going to probably be a bit more nuanced and kind of a little bit softer in its approach to making just a straight up agitprop film. Feel, the anger I was feeling and just the sort of idiotic obviousness of how brutal the system is and how necessary it is to just toss it and start over, So that's the kind of that was the big picture. So yeah, I started it back up in 2000, spring of 2018 or summer 2018, and then sort of worked on it for about another year and got the beautiful score. My friend Zach Watkins, who did the score, and so went down the following spring to record with him. And it kind of took another year or so, probably a bit too long, to be honest. But here we are now. So,
So just before we get into the film, could you just give us a little bit of a synopsis of Dark Cell Harlem Farm, please, Alex?
So the film is, it's short. The sort of short version is it hinges around an event in 1913 and the American, in Texas, the most American of states, right? And it was at a period what was considered a cycle of reform in the Texas prison system, where the prior year the state of Texas had outlawed private prisons. They were private plantations, but basically they were just hiring out prisoners who were dying, in the scores. And there was a sort of reformist effort. Also, the state wanted to wanted to get its free labor back, so they started buying up plantations. And so it was both an economic thing, but also there was this sort of, we're going to be more humane. And so this sort of cycle of reform, the big thing was they outlawed the bullwhip and the bat, which was what they used for punishment. And the new quote unquote humane alternative was what were called dark cells or hot boxes, which were basically these. Each prison plantation had a different one, and this was a one that they would put prisoners in. It was basically a dark cell, a 6 by 6 by 9 feet kind of thing, and they put prisoners in there who were rabble rousing or whatever, or transgressing in some way, and leave them for some period of time. It was basically modern equivalent of administrative segregation or isolation units. And so it was an incident. It was early September. There was workers organizing. So this is why I'm at Toll Funnel, right? This were they were laborers in the cotton fields, and they refused to work. It was a coordinated work stoppage, and as punishment, 12 prisoners who were all Black, all 17 to 18 years old, and they were put in a dark cell that was meant to hold one prisoner or two prisoners for 3 to 4 hours, and they were left there overnight. And this was early September, so in Texas, hot. And there was very slight ventilation holes. They were left overnight the next morning, and they were expressing, concern the next morning. Those concerns were ignored. The next morning, the guards opened up the cell, and 8 of the 12 had died. So that was the kind of incident. I came across it in a book about Texas prisons, one paragraph, and I was just sort of haunted by it, and so sort of pursued this story a little bit. Did research and did most of that kind of the research that's been done on it. And so this version of the film, I made an earlier version about almost the search for the history. And then this version was with, I made contacts with folks who had been formerly incarcerated, and actually a former prison guard who had sort of jumped sides and had become a sort of great preservationist of people's history, and especially the history of Black folks in the Houston area, the Sugar Land area. And so we went back down and shot. Originally, my plan was to shoot at the unmarked cemetery where 4 of the prisoners were buried. I was unable to do so because I was bringing formerly incarcerated people to that spot, and that spot is still part of as the film reveals, is part of it is still a prison. And so we went to an adjacent prison cemetery and did readings of this primary source materials. There's testimonies from the survivors of this incident. And so I had my folks reading those accounts, and then I would interview them about their own carceral experiences. So that was sort of the setup of the film. And then I sort of intercut, which is, I think, the question you were getting to about the sort of recurrence.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And so sorry for the long, you try to be quick, but it's a kind of a dense history. But I something that I was feeling even when I was originally going to make the film was it was going to be a film about the impossibility of reform. And I played with failure versus impossibility, but it's not failure. It's impossible to reform the system. And so that it sort of all really started to come into place more clearly when I started thinking about how you could actually map certain moments, these moments of reform, which then led to more pain and more suffering, right? So 1913 reform, people die in a box. Many of the people I was interviewing and working with had been in prison in the 1980s, which was a moment of huge reform in Texas prisons that didn't seem to affect their experiences. They had brutal experiences, right? And then I have another prisoner the former guard talking about how it felt to him like plantation time. So then you think back to Juneteenth, the end of slavery in America, and yet that just turned around into the creation of the new system, right? And so then I end on COVID, which is not exactly a reform moment, but just trying to give us this kind of through line all the way through. And so I mean that sort of recurrence, and this gets into your other question about time accumulating.
Yeah, that's true.
Was significant to me. It's and we can talk sort of maybe towards the end when we talk about new projects, because I'm feeling sort of exhausted with just making films about how things will never change or whatever, but it was that feeling of when will we learn that you can't reform a system that was born of slavery, that was kind of the overarching, and I got more forceful with that in the film. And that, I think, helped me to cut it together by having these interstitials of different dates that really push it right to the foreground. There's titles at the beginning. This is a film about prison abolition or prison reform. This is a film about the impossibility of prison reform, I decided to just be obvious about it and bludgeon my audience.
So if we could move maybe to, you obviously brought it up in your synopsis to the film, the sort of process you're taking with the ex-convicts within the film. To me, the sort of way you frame them reminded me a lot of the feminist consciousness raising films of the 60s and 70s, the sort of close-up, long take sort of interactions. I know you don't specifically use long takes within your film, but so I was wondering, sort of like this engagement also with the primary source material. So we're seeing them read for the first time the source material. They themselves are reading for the first time the source material. So what was the aim, first of all, with the sort of pro-filmic, your relationship with the ex-convicts, and then maybe how do you want us to see these moments?
Yeah, that was one of the questions I thought, oh, Cole's been thinking deeply about this in really good ways. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's funny. As you're, re-articulating it now, not in a Word document. The first thing I want to do is definitely pay homage to one of my primary filmmaking mentors. There's a feminist filmmaker named Irene Lustig, who is absolutely brilliant. Just incredible. Very smart filmmaker, very brilliant human, and somebody who has been influenced, I think, in her filmmaking with it in that style from 1970s. She's contemporary. I mean, she's maybe 5 years older than me, but was a mentor of mine in grad school. But she did a lot of work with direct address. Her last film was entirely that. It was women reading letters from Ms. Magazine, which was the feminist Gloria Steinem's magazine. And sort of direct address into the camera. And she went all over the United States and had people reading these letters. And so when I was in grad school, she kind of, I think, got me interested in performance and the sort of the performance of the past. And that's something I've always been very interested in my earlier films as well. I have a film Now Again, which is a little short, which is a kind of split screen of a past, present kind of thing. And I think one of the things I've always been kind of fascinated by is again, we talk about accumulation and these different things, but it's not that it's not that it's the same, and it's not that it's things do change, but there are certain underlying power structures that exist. For instance, this film I just referred to, Now Again, was about Ferguson, the Ferguson uprising, and it split screens with a film called Now, which was by Cuban filmmaker Santiago Alvarez, that he made about the civil rights movement. It was essentially a found footage film in the 60s. It's a 4-minute film, and so I did a split screen of. My film's called Now Again, and I have 1965, and then I have Ferguson, and I sort of matched it up visually. And that was inspired by my Facebook feed when people were posting civil rights pictures of Ferguson and, side by side and kind of saying like same shit, different day. And you see the resonances, but I saw also these differences, because I think it's not the same, but also it's not better in every case, right? People assume that means there's progress. But for instance, in Ferguson, you go from, batons to fire, they have these blow torches and stuff, the cops, and they're all wearing military garb. So that's not better, versus the civil rights movement in the 60s. So I'm really interested in having those, it's not about just collapsing them onto each other, but about seeing putting them next to each other and seeing where the tension is and where it's not. And so I don't think I pushed too much the difference as much in this in Dark Cell Harlem Farm, but I do have this thing where they're reading these primary source materials, and then they're also reflecting on their own experiences. And there are resonances there, and they reflect on those resonances. And to me, I think maybe that's what it comes to, is wanting to hear how they saw themselves in relation to that history. And they do in really beautiful ways. Those were folks I sort of got in touch with. I took earlier trips, and my background is in prison activism. And so sort of made contacts through people, and two of the people who were in the film, Reggie, who was the former guard, he was the kind of person who helped me get in contact with people down there. And then David, who's the one white person who reads, or the one formerly incarcerated person, he's a radio producer now at this prison radio show in Houston, which is a kind of long-standing prison show for prisoners on public radio. And so he helped me also contact other people and get in touch and find folks who would be interested in doing this. So that's kind of how it happened. It was a little bit fast, but you know, in terms of forming those relationships, but I think it went pretty well. So yeah.
So we're sort of at the moment moderately pressed for time. So
yes,
just
sure,
because
sure.
of my, well, it's my Zoom subscription. Unfortunately, I have the basic.
I can
model,
go
so.
on. I'm sorry, it's my bad.
No. So it's just the last two questions I have. So you sort of touched upon it. So essentially, why abolition and not reform?
Yeah, I mean, abolition, because the film, as the film points out, reform has never worked and never will work, in my opinion. And yeah, I mean, this is not a liberal film, right? This is a radical film. I'm in the right festival because I don't believe in reformism, essentially, at the end of the day, right? And that extends to capitalism, right? And prisons as being just a way to enforce capitalism, yes. Right? So there's your short. Short
Excellent. So to wrap up, are there any projects or groups or films you'll be working on in the future?
Yeah, I'm deep into my next film, which I'm very excited about because it's a film also about the past, but it's also meant to be a film that is hopeful and about the future. It's about a group called the George Jackson Brigade, who were a group in the 1970s, urban guerrilla group, they would be called, and conducted a series of bombings and actions in the Seattle area. They bombed the Department of Corrections, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They got into all sorts of good trouble, as they say, but really emerged out of the prison system and were an incredible group, interracial, queer, working class prisoners, and small group. But when I moved to Seattle, I got connected to people, and it turns out one of them, Janine Bertram, is my neighbor, and she lives up my alley. And so I sort of started hanging out with. There's just three surviving members. They all live within from 1 minute to 15 minutes from my house, and so I potted up with Janine for COVID and started working with them and started spending kind of deep time with them. And again, we can't get into it too much, but it's a film about them now, about our community, their community that they were generous enough to sort of bring me into. And in that sense, it's a film that I feel I'm excited about because they're a beautiful model of long struggle. They're still in the struggle in their 70s and 80s. And they're a community that takes care of themselves. That's mutual care. They take care of each other. I take care of them. They take care of me. And so for me, it's a film that's in some ways not a repudiation, but the Texas film, which I love, that still felt extractive to a point where I'm going down to a place that's not my place. And now this is a film about my community, but also, as I said, it's a film about the future. It's not a film about the past. There's a lot about the past in it, but it's meant to be a sort of a hopeful film instead of a film where, because I don't really provide any good solutions in Dark Cell Harlem Farm, I'm just like, toss it all in the rubbish. That's it. And so this is a film that's meant to be a little bit more forward thinking, not Pollyanna-ish or naive, but hopeful maybe. So
yeah, well, that sounds excellent. I look forward to seeing it in the future. Really piqued my interest.
Yeah. So that film, I'll just tell you, it's got a great title, not mine. It's from one of their communiques. So that film is called Cozy, Cuddly, Armed, and Dangerous. Yeah,
brilliant. Yeah. Well, we've reached the end of the interview here. I just want to take time to say thank you, Alex, for joining us, and best for all of your plans for the future.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm sorry I planned this trip poorly. I would be at the festival this weekend, and we could do this in person.